Chapter 9, Global Inequality. We are going to discuss the global divide, stratification in the world system, stratification with nations, a comparative perspective, and social policy and global inequality, rethinking welfare in Europe and North America. The global divide. So inequality is a significant determinant of human behavior. So there is a large global divide worldwide, and there is a large wealth divide within the U.S. Stratification in the world system. So there are contrasts that are vast and that are stark between industrial and developing nations. So basically, first world countries have a lot more resources and technology than third world countries. And we are going to discuss the legacy of colonialism, poverty, multinational corporations, and modernization. The legacy of colonialism. So that's wherein a foreign power maintains political, social, economic, and cultural domination for an extended period of time. So we have European colonialism, and that is how we have come to have the United States. The land was here before Europeans arrived. People were here before the Europeans arrived. And when the people that were here prior had more of an egalitarian system, so they would basically trade goods between one another. They didn't use money as a form of currency, and women had more rights. However, there were tribes that would fight amongst one another before the colonists came. And then after the foreign powers came and maintained domination, they continued that throughout the entire United States and then throughout the entire world. And now we have neocolonialism, and that's where we have a continued dependence on more industrialized nations for managerial and technical expertise by former colonies. So if you think of even the northern parts of the U.S. versus the southern parts, well, the southern parts had to rely more on the north throughout our history, and that's why in a lot of the cities, the north has more economic power than the South. So when it comes to relying on other places and people, we tend to keep moving south. So we think about there are jobs that have been sent to Mexico, and we have had the Presidio program where we had Mexicans come here and work as far as in agriculture to have the South still make profit since slavery ended and there was no longer free labor. The only free labor we now have is for people that are institutionalized in prison. The Wallerstein's world systems analysis is explained by the global economy and how it's unequal. So basically, countries are interdependent, so they're able to work independently, but they also depend on one another. So the countries which are labeled first world are the ones that are in power, and they drive the market and they drive the economy, versus the other countries that are basically there to serve as a support system. So some of the people that work there do earn more money than they would living just at home or working at a company where they're from. If you think of places like the Philippines, some of them don't have the same resources as we do here, so we'll sometimes take our products and move to other places. Also, other countries like Sri Lanka, there's just a lot across the world. And then there's a dependency theory, and it's even as developing countries make economic advances, they still remain weak and subservient to core nations and corporations. And the core nations are the ones that you would assume. It would be Europe, it's the US, it's all of the major companies. We could include Japan, China in there. A lot of the resources, as far as humans go, and natural resources, are redistributed to the core industrialized nations, and the U.S. is one of those nations. So basically, a lot of other countries are working to serve us and to serve our economy. And then we have globalization, and it's a worldwide integration of government, policies, cultures, social movements, and financial markets through trade and the exchange of ideas. So poverty is a worldwide problem. It affects millions of people. And in the U.S., we have a disagreement of where the poverty line should begin and end. If we look over at our neighbor Canada, so if you spend 40% or more of your income on bills, then that's considered poverty. Whereas here, a lot of people will spend either all of their paycheck or most of their paycheck and still not be considered in poverty enough to get government resources as far as welfare and all that. Many developing nations define poverty based on the minimum a person needs to survive. And if you look at a map of the world when it comes to poverty, a lot of places that have poverty are in Africa and Asia. This map is also in your book, and it just shows the distribution of wealth and poverty. So the ones that have the orange color or reddish color, depending on what you're looking at, it's a little bit different in my book. So they are across the board chronically deprived, and that would be of their basic resources as far as food, water, ability to move up. In the year 2000, the UN, United Nations, launched their Millennium Project, and they basically wanted the industrialized nations, so the first world nations, to help decrease global poverty. So they wanted these nations to set aside 0.51% of the gross national income for these developing nations. So not of the U.S., but of other smaller countries or territories across the world. And they want to decrease that poverty by half by the year 2015. They didn't make that mark, so they want to continue with this goal to continue to decrease the amount of people that are living in poverty. So this figure shows the amount of money that is given to foreign aid. And the U.S. is on there of how much we give. And then you see Sweden right now, at least as far as 2014, as far as this map goes, they gave the most. Multinational corporations, so it's a commercial organization that is headquartered in one country, but it does business throughout the world. If you think of countries such as Walmart, ExxonMobil, Toyota, Apple, they have their headquarters and then they do business all over the world. So figure 9.5 is the multinational corporations compared to nations. So you see Walmart and how much income they make compared to Denmark and Hungary put together. And then it just continues down the list. ExxonMobil makes a little more than Colombia. BP, British Petroleum, makes a little bit less than South Africa does. And as you see, Apple makes more than New Zealand as a country. From a functionalist perspective, the multinational corporations help developing nations as far as jobs, industry, technology. It gives a boost. As far as profits, it helps reduce the costs, and it makes nations more interdependent and less likely to enter conflicts because they're trading with one another continuously. With the conflict perspective, we have multinational corporations that exploit local workers to maximize profit. So that would be a huge company that is only paying their workers a low wage. And if they're pushed to increase that wage enough, then they will move to another country and then have people there work for less. And the company will still make a larger profit that way. So governments are seeking to attract or keep multinationals to develop a climate for investment. And then there's repressive anti-labor laws. Also, the conflict perspective talks about a negative social impact on workers in both countries. So the country that the company left, because those people might be without a job, and then also there might be a form of slavery in those other countries, sweatshops. And then the conflict perspective also says some studies have shown investment by multinationals at first contributes to a host nation's wealth, but eventually increases economic inequality within developing nations. And you think of Puerto Rico, like, yes, it's part of the U.S., but it's not considered a state. It is owned by the U.S., so it's a territory. And if you go there, there's places that are extremely beautiful and wealthy, and then there's other places that are extremely poor. And part of that is because Puerto Rico is basically still considered like a U.S. colony. Modernization. So it's a process by which peripheral nations, which would be those nations that don't have as much money, the ones that are still developing, and they move from traditional institutions to those characteristic of developed societies. So basically they're becoming more westernized, more modernized. So current studies generally take convergence perspectives. So societies are moving closer together. They're becoming more Western-like. And a conflict perspective says modernization of developing nations contributes to neocolonialism. And yes, that is true, because these larger companies will put a stake in some of these larger countries will put a stake in some of these less well-off countries, and then begin to dominate society there. So table 9-1 compares sociological perspectives on global inequality. We have the world systems analysis, and it's part of the functionalist and conflict perspectives. So they state that unequal economic and political relationships maintain sharp divisions between nations. So the country that is dominating will have some negativity that's coming from the country that is subservient to them. Dependency theory from the conflict perspective says industrialized nations exploit developing nations through colonialism and multinational corporations. So basically coming in there and plowing their system and basically having them meet our needs. So they're working for us. And modernization theory, which is the functionalist perspective. So developing nations move away from traditional cultures and toward the cultures of industrialized nations, and that would be becoming more westernized. So there's a stratification as far as wealth goes in the U.S., within Louisville itself in Kentucky, and then also throughout the world globally. So there's a huge gap, and it's continuing to increase and increase and increase. So the poor are getting poorer, the wealthy are getting much wealthier, and the middle class is being squeezed. So stratification in developing nations closely related to weak dependent position in global economy. So depending on where a country or territory falls within the wealth of the world globally, depends how much the people are also stratified within that system. So you might think that some wealthier countries have, more access and everyone has money, but that's not completely true. Sometimes some people are really wealthy in those countries and others still have little to nothing. The richest 2% own more than 50% of the world's household wealth. In at least 17 nations around the world, the most affluent, so the most wealthy, 10% of the population receives at least 40% of all income. Social mobility. So this is a concept where a person is able to move up economically. So some people will live the same way their parents lived as far as social mobility. That's not always true, but on average, most people stay in the same position or maybe go one step higher or one step lower. So it's influenced by structural factors, and that could be where somebody lives. It could depend on their health. It could depend on racism. It can depend on immigration. It can depend on if companies are closing here and moving overseas. So immigration continues to be significant in shaping a society's level of intergenerational mobility. So the more people migrate here, the more they're going to do better for their children, and their children do even better than the children that's going to come up. So it just continues to help as far as intergenerational mobility, moving up in society. And growth in mobility does not necessarily bring growth in equality. So just because two people are physicians does not mean that their mobility, their access to certain things in this world are going to be equal. It doesn't bring equality. They might earn the same paycheck, but looking at a lot of factors and looking at how income is distributed, even when it comes to jobs with the same amount of skills, it just depends. So Asian men are at the top as far as making most money, and then it goes into white men, and it continues to go down from there. Mobility in developing nations. So macro level social and economic changes often overshadow micro level. So what it's saying is that huge changes in their economy on a huge level overshadows what might be occurring for people on their individual levels. And then gender differences in mobility. So there's sex discrimination, female infanticide. So that's where the babies are being killed if they were females, just depending on the country. And then as country develops and modernizes, women's vital role in food production deteriorates, jeopardizing the autonomy and material well-being. So there are huge gender differences depending on the countries. Some countries, women are still, for the first time, learning to drive as of now. And of course, that's very different here in the U.S. Social policy and global inequality. So rethinking welfare in Europe and North America. So as far as 1996, there was a Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, and that changed how welfare was administered, basically changing the way people qualify for welfare. And it's saying it's more of a personal responsibility, so it's not something that people should be on for their entire lives. But back in the day here, people were just given land because they didn't have any. And it's very different now as far as what people are given. They're given access to food stamps, access to money, vouchers for heat and electricity and certain things, maybe even for housing. But the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act actually made it stricter and more difficult for people to qualify for welfare. So the U.S. government safety net falls short of safety net established in Europe and also in other developing nations. So they have more access to certain things. Their education might be free, so people are able to move up socially and also financially. And their health care might be given to them, or it might be provided through the monarchy, or they might have higher taxes, but they have their form of universal health care. And so if someone were to get sick or spend time off work from having a baby, well, those things aren't really counted against them as far as income. And there's much higher expenditures in housing, Social Security, welfare, healthcare, and unemployment compensation in most other industrialized nations as compared to the U.S. So basically, most other nations are getting more than we get if we end up in any of these situations. So when we think of welfare and people that qualify for welfare and if it should be reformed or if people should have more access, I think it's also important to think about the big businesses that are continuously bailed out. It happens with banks, it happens with the housing market, but it didn't really happen to help regular people because a lot of people lost their homes in the last market crash around 2008. But these companies are bailed out. The car companies, some of these tech companies, they're continuously bailed out. So it's interesting. They're also given tax breaks and direct payments and grants to help them build more and maybe keep more jobs here. But it's interesting that a lot of these companies still will send their jobs overseas. So I think there needs to be some conversation as far as that goes of what people deserve and what companies deserve.